Okay, good afternoon to everybody, and we're going to get started with today's class session. So I'm going to go and record this, which I don't usually do for this class, but I want to make sure that everyone is able to be able to retrieve this information, particularly as you are looking to prepare for the second exam, which is second final exam in this class, which is coming up this week. So it's going to be available today. It'll probably be sometime very shortly after class today. It'll be this afternoon for sure, and you've got Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday to work on it. You'll have 90 minutes to do it, so that should be really plenty of time to complete the exam, and hopefully that won't be too difficult for you. It's going to cover a lot of the material that we've covered up until the previous up until now, and so what I wanted to do in this class session today was basically go over some of the content of the exam. It's also a good chance for you to all ask questions as well. It looks like we have pretty good attendance today, which is good. And so that should set you up fairly well for success on the second exam itself. One thing I should mention to you as well is that the sixth quiz 6 is also available, and it was available last week and as well as this week. And so I think it works well to extend these out over a couple of weeks, and it allows you time to take it over and over again, those quizzes, that is, not the exams, but the quizzes. And so that gives you a chance to continue to work on that up until Sunday evening. And so, and the highest score will be the one that populates the grade system. Okay. So as to the exam itself, I know that occasionally we can allow students to do a makeup of things like quizzes and exams. The problem we've got with an end of the semester exam like this is the fact that we just really don't have the time in order to allow a makeup exam. In a very rare, unusual circumstance, if I'm able to get an exam, if for whatever reason, maybe you get cut off at exam question 30 or whatever, and you just go just a little bit to finish the exam, but maybe an outside chance that we can let you do it on Monday. But I've got to report grades by Monday evening, which is really what I intend to do. So just given the fact that it's really a tight time reporting time frame, and the college really does stick to it. I mean, if you don't turn your grades in, they're sort of calling us and sort of prodding us to get that in. So unfortunately, there's really no opportunity to have like a week-long makeup period. It just doesn't really exist. Okay. So as to the exam itself, let me give you a brief heads up here as to what we're looking at here as to the exam. So we are going to be, let's see, do I have any markers here? That's the big question. So the exam will be available beginning today. Okay, there's some markers right there. So the exam will be available beginning today. So this is exam 2, which is basically the final exam, and it's going to go back. It's going to cover a lot of the material that we've covered in the class up to this point, including some of the early content that we covered. So it's going to be 40 questions, and they're going to be 40 questions altogether, and they're going to be 10 true/false questions. So we know how to answer those. 10 true/false. Was almost out of ink. So let me move on it. And then 30 multiple choice questions. Okay, it's going to be available in Brightspace. Okay, so it's going to be available in Brightspace. The final due date is going to be due 4/23, which is Sunday, 11:59 p.m. And you'll have 90 minutes. Okay, 90 minutes to complete the exam. So should be fairly straightforward. And I think that after my going over some of the content that you want to know about, remember, I think you should be in pretty good shape for the exam itself. Okay, so let's talk about the exam and what to expect. And really, this is a small enough group. We've always been a small enough group that if you have questions for me, that you can always feel free to ask them. I mean, I'm always available to answer questions and whatnot. Plus, available over the weekend as well if you do have any questions or difficulties. So let's talk about what to expect on the exam that's coming up this week. So you want to know about this issue of the two types of government policy which are applied to stabilizing the economy. That is the ups and downs of the business cycle that every economy faces. And we've really got two forms: fiscal policy, which is in this country controlled by Congress and the president, and monetary policy, which is conducted by the Federal Reserve. And the key thing to know about the way these folks get their positions is the fiscal policymakers are all elected. All members of Congress, every president is elected. Members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the committee that makes monetary policy are appointed. So that is really an important distinction because of the fact that these members who make monetary policy decisions don't face the public, don't face the voting public, they don't stand for re-election. So as a result, they're called upon to make the decisions that sometimes need to be made that are not politically popular, like what they're doing right now, raising interest rates pretty dramatically to slow the economy down. It may cause a recession, so we'll have to see where that ends up. Okay. Also know about, and most of these are in the PowerPoint slides themselves, so it's a pretty good resource, plus your notes for class. Know about what would the fiscal policy authorities do in the event of something like a recession or high inflation. What would they do? In the case of a recession, they probably would lower taxes and cut government spending. Okay, that's probably what they would do. Both of those are stimulative of the economy that could push the economy back to full employment if the economy is in a recession. If the economy is in an inflationary condition, growing too quickly, they might raise taxes and cut government spending, just the opposite sort of medicine for a different particular ailment. So kind of know about what those are about. Also, with regard to fiscal policy, we talked about a series of lags, and we said that by lag we mean there's a delay between something happening and something else happening. And the first of these lags is called a recognition lag, and it's the idea that it takes some time to recognize what's going on in the economy. So it could be the fact that the economy is in a recession and we just don't know it because all the information we have is historical, and it's not really super old, but it's pretty old, and we don't really know what the economy is doing until for a while yet. So it takes a bit of time to understand the economy's kind of inflationary condition or a recessionary condition. By the way, these lags also work in monetary policy. And I think it did take some time for the Federal Reserve to really appreciate the inflation that was happening. But the lags that with fiscal policy are ones that accumulate one to the other. That leads to an administrative lag. That's the time it takes to decide what to do. And these lags are cumulative. They add on to one another. So we call them cumulative lags. And the final one is the implementation of the operational lag. It's the time it takes for something to actually get done once a policy is implemented. That is, what is the effect once this policy is put into place. And so these lags, they're cumulative lags. They build on one another. And that's really what it means by these lag effects. They're cumulative in nature. Okay, so kind of know what those are and know why they're important, because it really does add to the time in which it takes to devise policy and to deal with something that's going on in the economy. Okay. There are a number of questions about money and what to know about it. And the thing that we discussed about money when we had this discussion in class was the fact that it's not backed by precious metals. And that's an important thing to know, because I think, as I mentioned earlier in the class, I think there's a feeling among some that money is all backed by gold. And it's not. And it used to be at one point backed by gold. It used to be backed by gold and silver. Today, it's just backed by nothing other than the full faith and credit of the US government. And so we call it fiat. F-I-A-T, fiat. That is the term for money. So, and that's money that's not backed by precious metals. So most money today in the world is not backed by precious metals, simply because of the fact that there's simply not enough precious metals to match to basically account for the value of the money supply, which would match all the output of goods and services that are going on in the world, which is substantial. Okay. Also, we talked about externalities. What are these externalities? There are these. We define them as being spillover effects of one economic activity onto others who are unrelated to that activity. We call them bystanders. So one example is pollution. Pollution is an externality. A business is a firm is in the business of making plastic, but because they're making plastic, they're also creating air pollution, water pollution, groundwater contamination, whatever the case might be. And so as a result, that's an externality, and that would be a negative externality. That's a bad thing. There are also positive externalities that can be generated as well. We talked about the example of things like vaccinations. Somebody would get a vaccination for their own purposes, but because they don't get sick, they also don't make others sick from infectious disease as well, like the flu or whatever. And so that's considered a positive externality. So these are unintended, but they're positive effects or negative effects, whichever the case might be. And of course, pollution is one of those that's sort of a classic case of an externality. Okay. All right. We also talked about taxes and income taxes, that is, and the way that they work in terms of taxing people based upon income. This and we first talked about the idea of taxes back when we talked about Adam Smith some time ago. And what did Smith first recommend? He recommended a quote unquote progressive tax, meaning, and there was no income tax in those days, but there wasn't a really very good way to account for income in the 18th century. There was no real formal accounting system, but instead wealth was taxed. And it was those who had most wealth, that is the most land, was taxed, and were taxed. And so as a result, it was a progressive tax. That is the most people most able to pay were the ones who were taxed the most. That's the policy he recommended. And today, when we have a system we tax more of people who earn more, we call that a progressive tax. There are taxes that we tax people more who earn less. The sales tax is an example of that. And the reason that sales tax is regressive is because lower income households spend most, if not all, of their income. So as a result, more of their income is subject to sales tax, whereas higher income households can generate some savings, and thereby channeling that portion of their earned income from sales tax. So taxation can be progressive or progressive. Income taxes at the federal level and at our state level, most state levels are progressive. They go up as income goes up. Okay. Okay, let me see here. Okay, I'm kind of flipping some of this I've talked about a second ago. So you want to know what the tools of monetary policy are and the tools of fiscal policy. When it comes to monetary policy, we said there are three key tools. One is the managing of the reserve ratio, the RRR, the required reserve ratio. That ratio is simply a percentage of bank deposits that these banks have to set aside on deposits at the Federal Reserve. They can't lend them, they can't invest them. And that's a means to control the money supply, because if the Federal Reserve raises that percentage, it means there's less money out floating around the economy in the form of loans and investments. Banks can't use that money. They lower it, puts more money into play. Puts more money into play. The second of these is called the management of the discount rate. The discount rate is the rate at which banks can borrow money from the Federal Reserve itself, directly from the Federal Reserve. So if that rate is lowered, it makes money cheaper, and so as a result, banks will tend to borrow more, lowers rates in general. And, excuse me, if it's raised, it makes money more expensive, and so as a result, that tends to raise rates in general. Okay. And then the third is open market operations, which is the active buying and selling of government securities in the market in order to increase or decrease the amount of money at play in the economy itself. Okay, that's what that's for. Sorry, my allergies are kind of picking up here, so it's kind of difficult. So, and then know about the tools of fiscal policy, which are taxation and government spending, and know how those work. Know that if the economy is in the doldrums, it's very sluggish, lots of unemployed people, then as a result, the government should cut taxes and increase government spending. If it's just the opposite, where the economy is speeding along, we've got inflationary conditions, the government might want to think about raising taxes and cutting government spending. Those are contractionary policies as opposed to the earlier expansionary policies. The problem with that is that it's difficult to count on elected officials to do that. It's really not what they like to do. For obvious reasons, it's not particularly popular to slow the economy down. So as a result, we usually rely upon the Federal Reserve to do it because they are not elected. Okay. Okay, let me see here. So you want to know about those tools. Know about this idea of budget deficits. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about budgets. And it's primarily the federal budget we're talking about here. So remember, when taxes are insufficient to cover government spending, that is T is less than G, right? We say that the economy has a budget deficit, and that is the idea that the government is spending more than what it takes in. If it's just the opposite, where tax revenue coming into the government exceeds the amount that it spends outward, then it's a budget surplus. And only in the last 4 years out of the last 60 plus has the government had a surplus. We've had mostly deficits, and as a result, what does the government do typically to finance it? Do they just print more money? Well, they could, and sometimes they actually can, although the printing is not really what's going on there. but instead they typically borrow the money, and that's what they do. That's why we have a national debt, which is the accumulation of all that borrowing over time, because we've been borrowing for a very long time to pay off, well, to borrow money to fund current expenditures over and above what we were the present taxpayers. So as a result, the United States has still got the debt on the books for World War II and World War I and all these other expenses. And as a result, we just keep refinancing it, and the national debt continues to grow. How big of an issue that is? Well, that's something that we disagree about. Economists do. And so as a result, we'll have to see where the limit is. We've got about $30 trillion of government debt. So it's a pretty big number. And we'll see what the implications are of that over time. Okay. Okay, so now about surpluses and deficits. And whether equal or more or less equal, we say we have a balanced budget. Okay, a balanced budget. That's the idea that if taxes more or less equal government spending in a given year, we say the budget is balanced. So that's sort of a worthwhile goal, I think, except for the fact that it's sometimes difficult to get there. And in the years in which we've had a surplus, there was discussion about, maybe the government was going to get surpluses as far as the eye can see and just pay off the national debt. Well, that never really happened because the government, we had some voices of government saying this is your money, and so they, as a result, cut taxes, and we went back into deficit. So it does. It's not always the case that the government will try to achieve a balanced budget or even a surplus, but it is theoretically possible because it has happened. Okay. All right. You want to know about this issue of let me see. I've got my notes here. Excuse me just a second. Some of my notes are a little bit missing here. So okay, I wanted to skip that question here. So let me see. Express policy, okay. Okay, let's bear with me here just a second. Okay, so all right. I want to make sure that I have my notes in front of me here. Okay, all right. So when we talk about externalities, we also mentioned the fact that there were that there is an added cost to society from an externality if it's negative. Okay, if there's a negative externality, we say it's a marginal social cost. That is something like pollution or unsafe products or even criminal conduct, which is not intended to harm society necessarily. It's more about the person committing the offense in order for that person to gain. But nonetheless, these are all spillover effects, and they add what we call a marginal social cost onto society. It's over and above the cost of whatever the activity is itself. And so one of the ways to deal with this is taxing it, that is internalizing the externality. If it's a negative, if it's a positive externality, we call it a marginal social benefit. That is, it's a benefit over and above the actual benefit to the user itself of the activity, and it spills over onto society. So something like a vaccination would be a positive and therefore generate a marginal social benefit. Okay, so these marginal, and they're simply marginal because they simply they grow over time incrementally as these goods are consumed. Okay. All right. Let me see here. You want to know about so let's talk about these tools of monetary policy. I talked a bit about it a second ago. The reserve ratio, that's that percentage the banks must set aside. They can't lend it, they can't invest it. What about the discount rate? The discount rate is, we said it was mostly symbolic. It's the rate at which banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve. And but it's not used very often, mostly because, as I indicated, it's mostly symbolic. A lot of banks don't want to do it because it sort of represents or sort of telegraphs to the world that, hey, this bank is in trouble. Because why? Because the Federal Reserve is the lender of last resort, and therefore, if you can't borrow money anywhere else, you go to the Federal Reserve, and that's not what they want to do. So it's mostly symbolic. The Fed funds rate is actually much more important as a rate, and that's the rate at which banks lend to each other overnight. Okay, so that's what is important to know as far as that goes. Okay. You want to know about these two components of the money supply, M1 and M2. Okay, so when we talk about the money supply, think about the money supply as being all of M2 and then of M2, a subset of that is M1. So all of M1 folds into M2, meaning that the money supply is this giant pool of money, some of which is M1, which is very liquid, that is easily convertible to cash. And it includes things like currency, like in your pocket and coins and cash registers and whatnot. Checking account deposits are also included. But then if we go upward then to less liquid forms of money, we get into the M2 portion of that, and it's less liquid. It's money that's tied up in a savings certificate, like a CD, certificate of deposit, something like that, where it's not as easily convertible to cash. And if it is, there's often a penalty. So those certificates those vehicles are less liquid. So you want to know what those are: cash, coin, checking deposits, traveler's checks. All those are M1. Everything else is M2. And they tend to be M2. The M2 portion tends to be more interest bearing. The M1 portion much less interest bearing. Okay, in that regard. If you also want to know about what the definition of open market operations is, without getting into the nitty gritty of that, because if you do take macroeconomics, we'll get into that much more. But it's simply the active involvement in the government securities market by the Federal Reserve and trying to influence the money supply. If they want to put money into the economy, they'll buy government securities. That way, people who are holding bonds now are holding cash because they sold them to the Fed, which bought them from them. And so as a result, there's now more money out there in the economy. If the Fed wants to take money out, they'll simply sell bonds. People who are holding cash now are owning bonds because the Fed sold it to them at attractive prices. And as a result, that takes money out of the economy and slows the economy down. So that's what, in a nutshell, is what open market operations is. It's considered to be the most effective of the three tools. That is the reserve ratio, discount rate, open market operations. That last one, open market operations, is considered to be the most effective because it's very fast. And when it's done usually fairly quickly, successfully, and in very large quantities of activity. Okay. Know what the definition of an externality is, and this is just a simple definition. It's the idea that externality is the unintended consequence of some activity. That is, we're a firm making steel. We also create pollution. We didn't set out to make pollution, but pollution is what is a byproduct. It's just part of the activity itself, and so as a result, we're polluting the environment. That's unintended, and generally it's also uncompensated, but that's essentially what an externality really is. Okay. All right. Let's see what we're going to get. Any questions so far about anything? Okay. Well, we talked a bit in class about some of the solutions, what are called corrections of externalities, and one of those is to simply, if it's a negative externality, simply tax it. And it's called a Pigovian tax. That's P-I-G-O-V-I-A-N. It's in your slide package, and it's this PowerPoint slides. It's based upon the work of a guy named Cecil Pigot, and Pigot was arguing for active participation in the economy by government in order to achieve social welfare aims. And this is the idea that if government can improve market outcomes by taxing the bads which are produced, then they can reduce those. And so if we tax the polluters for their pollution, we end up internalizing the externalities, the way that the term goes. And if it's something good, then we tend to subsidize it. And by the way, one of the examples that we talked about with regard to positive externalities, vaccinations. Well, we certainly saw the government vaccinate pretty much anybody who wanted to get vaccinated over and over again, and without cost to themselves. I don't think any of us paid to get COVID shots, and things like flu shots tend not to be very expensive. I know I can walk over to UNM and get a flu shot for free every fall, and so that's possible to do. So somebody pays for it, government pays for it. In higher education, getting a college degree is considered to be to generate a positive spillover, and so we definitely subsidize higher education, no question about it. Okay, so those are Pigovian solutions. There are other solutions more market-based, and one of those is called the Coase theorem, which deals primarily with negative externalities. It's Coase, C-O-A-S-E, the Coase theorem, based upon the work of the economist Ron Coase. And Coase was interested in this idea of avoiding legal and governmental solutions by saying, look, if people are rational, they'll come to an agreement as to what the externality is that's been created. And therefore avoid court and avoid, trying to go to the government and government intervene, which may take a very long time, if ever. But it's a faster way to resolve the situation. So, and it's had a lot of particular usefulness in the law itself. He taught in the law school at the University of Chicago, so that should kind of tell you a little bit about something about the fact that his work was viewed very positively by the legal community, and he won the Nobel Prize for that particular set of theories. Also, we talked about the uses of money, not just the supply of money, but the uses of money. And we said that, look, there are really three kinds of uses for money, and that is beyond just the standard usage of substituting for a barter system. A barter system is simply one that if I want something from you, that I trade something I've got. But that assumes that I've got something you want, you've got something I want. And then we have to agree still on the problem of what the exchange value is of those goods. That's a real difficult proposition. So if we simply introduce money, we get around that problem of barter. So as a result, when we talk about the uses of money, we really have three uses. Number one is a medium of exchange, which is the most common one that we have heard. It's the one we're introduced to from the very beginning. We've all used money to buy something, even as a child. That's the most obvious form. But then also money is a store of value, which means that we can take money, we can put it aside, save it in its current form without converting it to something like real estate or cash or gold or real estate or whatever. And then the third is what we call a unit of account. That's simply the way that we account for the value of assets and liabilities and income expenses. It's the measuring stick that we use to measure economic and financial performance. Okay, so know about those uses of money and what those are about. Okay, let me see here. And again, just if you want to have a question, just speak up, but I'm really glad to help you there. So we talked a bit about the Govian taxes. Let me see here. Okay. I've cut some of these out the previous time I used this. We don't always cover the same thing every time. So bear with me, I'm just sort of going through this. I'm still sort of putting this together. So, okay, know about the responsibility of fiscal policy. I kind of went over this a minute ago, but just know that the key thing here is the fact that the fiscal policy is enacted by Congress and the president, and they're elected. Monetary policy run by the Federal Reserve, they are unelected. Those are the important things to know about that. We also talked about something called the quantity theory of money equation. It was the equation MV equals PQ. It was in your PowerPoint package one of the weeks, and just if you want to just open and save those documents, you can. Those files are yours to do with it. But there's a question about what is V, money velocity. It's the number of times money turns over in a given year. So in a $26 trillion economy like what we've got, we don't need $26 trillion of money floating around. That would be crazily inflationary. And instead, we need something less than that because money will recycle itself. It'll be reused over and over again. So that the number of times that money turns over is what we call the velocity, the rate of velocity in the economy. That's what's the quantity theory of money is based upon that idea. Okay. We also talked in this last couple of weeks or so about the economics of crime, and we particularly focused on the work of Gary Becker. And one thing that Becker believed was that people who commit crimes are those who have a higher preference for risk than does the average person. Most people don't commit serious crimes. I mean, I can't say that probably none of us have ever run over the speed limit or thrown something out the window of our car or something like that. I mean, I'm sure we've all violated minor infractions, but committing serious crimes, hopefully let's hope it's a minority. But Becker is saying that one reason why people do commit crimes is because they believe the crime pays because they have a higher, and as a result, they have a higher preference for risk. That is the uncertainty of an outcome. They think they're going to get away with it. In fact, he says that almost nobody would ever commit a crime if they thought they would not get away with it. But even if they don't, Becker is saying, look, that going to jail is maybe not that serious of a penalty in the minds of some, which I know to a lot of people sounds completely bonkers, but a lot of criminals who've been in jail before know what it's about. They've been there and they'd rather do the time than pay the money to repair the damage. Becker was arguing the more effective punishment would be an economic penalty, make people pay the cost of the crime. Now, he excludes rape and murder from those because he is saying, look, first of all, there's probably often not an economic motivation. Sometimes there is with murder for hire, I guess, but that's not common. And it's usually these are crimes of emotion, crimes of passion in his mind, and that there's no economic justification for it because there's no economic rationale. And so therefore you have to exclude that from this calculation. He's talking more here about things like violent crime, like robbery, burglary, auto theft. It's mostly those sorts of property crimes, and to make people pay the cost of it. Or if it is like an assault battery, make somebody pay the cost, and that's a much more effective way in his mind. Not everyone buys that, and Becker's not saying that you should buy it, but he's simply saying, look, this is the way that I've assessed how people who commit crimes are assessing the marginal benefits versus the marginal costs. Okay. All right. We talked about another economist in a couple of different contexts, 2 or 3 different contexts. Milton Friedman, we talked about him as sort of the head of the face of what's called a monetarist school of thought. And that formula MB equals PQ, the quantity theory of money, he's sort of responsible for reviving it and popularizing it once again in the economics world. But he also had something to say about the economics of crime, in particular narcotics, and he recommended that the government legalize all narcotics, which I think was very shocking to people. This is 50 plus years ago that he talked about it. And he's not talking just about cannabis products like what we have in New Mexico and Colorado and many other places, but he's talking about every drug. And his view was that, making it illegal is not going to reduce the usage. And if you do legalize it, you can improve the quality, you can regulate it, tax it, all those kinds of things. And it's a very controversial idea, but it is nonetheless an idea that he's responsible for. And in some ways, maybe we're moving in that direction. I don't know. I think we're pretty far off of legalizing a lot of the very hard drugs, but nonetheless, for its time, it was pretty radical. And I think that a lot of people, I personally, and since I'm probably the oldest person in this gathering here, I think I'm a little surprised that marijuana was ever legalized, because I'm old enough to remember when it was always discussed as being a very serious drug in schools and whatnot. And it's a bit of a surprise to me, but the longer you live, the more surprises will come up. So anyway, that's what Friedman was the one responsible for coming up for that particular idea. Okay. All right. Know about what monetary policy actions will be appropriate given different scenarios that they're faced with. So, and we're talking about the Federal Reserve here. So if the economy is very sluggish, lots of unemployment, very slow growth, they will lower interest rates in order to encourage borrowing. And borrowing will put money into play in the economy, and it will stimulate things, particularly those very interest rate sensitive parts of the economy, like real estate connected parts of the economy are very sensitive to interest rate fluctuations. The auto industry, for instance, a lot of people finance automobiles with borrowing. So as a result, that would be appropriate. But if the economy is zooming along rapidly, we've got very low unemployment, but very high inflation, which is where we are right now, the Federal Reserve will raise rates, which is what they've been doing now for over a year. They're trying to raise rates to slow the economy down. And as they slow the economy down, it makes borrowing more expensive. So fewer people are buying cars. We know that real estate has been really just hit hard. And it's kind of a double whammy for commercial real estate at the moment, because a lot of businesses are seeing a lot of people not return to the workplace, but rather work from home. So that area is suffered badly. That, with higher interest rates, makes it sort of difficult to be in that particular line of work right now. But it's by design to slow the economy down. You have to, and one of the tools the Fed can use, the Federal Reserve can use, is to raise interest rates. Okay. Let me see. We talked about Stephen Levitt a little bit in class, and Levitt argued. This is the economics of crime section, And Levitt argued that one of the explanations in his mind, and it is his theory, and I told the class, whenever it was we talked about that this is among the most controversial topics that I think I've ever heard in economics. But he argued that the drop in crime in the 1990s was due to the fact that many people were not born because of legalized abortion beginning in the 1970s. And he called it the issue of wantedness, not wantedness, but wantedness, that people who are wanted are much more cared for and nurtured by parents and others than those who are not. And that's his particular point of view. And I know that there's lots of hubbub and lots of vitriol on this particular topic. But nonetheless, it's something that got people talking, certainly. And today, of course, abortion is very much in the news because of the Supreme Court's decision to strike down Roe versus Wade. So, we're hearing a lot about it, and I don't think people disagree vehemently on the subject when he's not really getting into the idea of whether it is or should not be legal. He's just simply saying this is how he explains the drop in crime, which was not anticipated. It was a very steep reduction in crime in the 1990s. So, but that's his particular theory. You can take it or leave it. But as I've said earlier on in the class, that there are things that maybe you don't agree with. There are things maybe I don't agree with that we have to cover because they are part of the discussion, part of the discourse in economics as we sort of work our way to try to find out what the reality is. Okay. We also talked about we talked about poverty quite a lot in the class. We talked about the idea of what is the poverty line, so to speak, in this country. There is no one dividing. There's no one line that says, okay, now you're living in poverty, now you're not living in poverty. It's based upon the average daily diet times three. So obviously, people need more money to survive on than just for food, but clothing and rent and all that. But nonetheless, it's times three. That's the value. It's a little bit different for those over 65 because they have healthcare costs, which are mostly subsidized by the government. But nonetheless, you kind of get the idea as to what that's about. Okay. And then we talked about this idea of population and why population growth expanded so dramatically, beginning in the 18th century, 19th, 20th centuries, and it paralleled the rise of the Industrial Revolution. There's no question about it. That the fact that the Industrial Revolution simply created urbanization, it created lots more activity, lots more wealth, lots more ability to support more people, including, by the way, improvements in agriculture, which, had they not been accompanied along with industrialization, would have probably made this population surge impossible. But we've grown very dramatically to over 7 billion people on the planet, and it's something that, even though the forecasts, and I think I gave you a couple of different forecasts for where this might top out, 9 billion, 10 billion, 11 billion, I mean, we've heard all kinds of different numbers. It is expected to slow down in terms of the growth rate. So we'll have to see what happens as far as that goes over time. So speaking of population, we go back to the work of Thomas Malthus. And what did Malthus have to say about population? Malthus said that, look, the growth in population is frightening, at least at the time he was writing, which was the early stage of this growth in population. And it's frightening because that population growth could easily outstrip the growth in the food production and therefore lead to mass starvation. So that would not be an outcome anybody would want. Obviously turned out not to have been the case necessarily, okay? Because global food production has increased and farmers and everybody concerned with the food chain has been much more productive. And these improvements in productivity continue all the time. Now we're into things like genetically modified seeds and things like that. And so it looks like that is, his fears were probably, I mean, they were probably warned at the time, but as it turns out, events happen differently. Okay. So I wanted to sort of include here in this exam some of the economic theory that we talked about at different points in the class, because as I have been talking about things like poverty and income and wealth distribution or maldistribution, whatever the case might be, these authors that we talked about early on keep coming up. So we talked about global poverty. It's impossible not to bring up the work of Marx. Karl Marx talked about this idea that industrialization causes a real break in society. That is, you've got those earning much, much more than others who are earning less and less, and they have no real bargaining power. Now, Marx's solution, which was simply oh, the industrial class is probably woefully, unworkable, frankly. I mean, it's just, I don't know that there's anybody today who would argue that that's a good solution. There are other solutions for income and wealth maldistribution, but simply throwing people out of ownership of factories is probably not one of them. It's not considered to be a viable solution. But he did have some interesting observations as to what he called the labor theory of value, the idea that the value comes from labor, and that is the idea that we create things, and so as a result, labor can become disconnected from the value of its labor. Now, today, I think that issue is, we had a discussion question on this particular topic, and I think today most economists would believe that that also is a bit of an incomplete theory because of the fact that there's so many inputs today that are of a very high-tech nature, over and beyond labor, that labor theory of value has not really held up very well. So, but he was an important character, and keep in mind, he did influence a lot of the thinking of many of the government systems that were established sometime in the 20th century, starting with Russia, moving on to the People's Republic of China and Cuba and many others. Okay? So they looked to his work to be important. We also talked about John Maynard Keynes and his work. That was the idea that government should be involved in trying to prevent an economy from slipping too deeply into a recession or depression by saying that, look, government can't count on, well, we can't count on the private sector, that is households and firms, to boost spending when the economy is in dire straits. We need government to step in, and in order to jump into the economy and boost it through government spending, tax cuts, and all that. Now, obviously, there was a pushback against that by the quote unquote classicists led by Milton Friedman, who said, look, the problem with that, it sounds very nice, except for the fact that once you get government involved in something like a new agency, it can never go away. So as a result, government continues to grow and grow and grow. And when do we ever see departments completely shut down? It does happen, but I mean, he makes a point that is hard to argue against in that regard, because they do tend to sort of stay in place for a time. And so as a result, yes, it's difficult to see government agencies going away. Okay, so Keynes argued for government intervention in the economy. And one of the things he argued was that the economy is not self-correcting. And this pushes back against the idea of even the very earliest classicists like Smith and Ricardo, who said that, look, the economy is more or less just a collection of markets. And as a result, they operate pretty efficiently. If there's a surplus or a shortage, it works its way out as actors sort of get back to gauge things. And more or less that is true. But Keynes is saying, look, the economy is not just a collection of markets, it's something bigger. There's a money supply going on, there's government, there's taxes and government spending. There are changes in technology, there are imports and exports happening. So you've got to look at the big picture as well. And he's saying that the economy is not self-correcting, that we need sort of tend to it like a garden, so to speak. And the gardener in this case would be the government. Okay. We also talked a bit about the work of some of the Austrian school, in particular the work of Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was the author of a famous book published in the 1940s called The Road to Serfdom. And one of the things that's interesting about Hayek is that he is sort of one of those economists who sort of pushed back against Keynes's work in saying, look, this is the problem. We don't want government to be too involved in the economy because we don't need it for it to be too involved. And we can sort of work these things out on our own. Even in the case of a recession, we will work our way back to full employment. Because the problem is that if you get government is responsible for some of the worst excesses that have ever been perpetrated by mankind. And interestingly enough, Milton Friedman sort of shared that particular view by saying that some of the worst things that have ever been done have been done by government. So therefore, let's not have strong governments. Let's have governments that serve the people so that we can engage in doing our own free activity. We've got free will to do what we would like to do, including in economics and politics. And Hayek's background was also in law prior to becoming an economist, so he's got that sort of background going as well. And then the last two that we talked about early on, whose work pops up again and again, Adam Smith, who talked about, he was one of the very first to describe the division of labor, the idea that people do different things so they can specialize in certain areas. He also talked about this idea of something called the invisible hand, which is this sort of, it sounds a little bit mystical maybe a little bit supernatural, but it's the idea that as we all sort of tend to our own business, the economy itself grows because we're all active and productive, but we're doing things. And as a result, we interact with each other, and everyone is better off as a result of sort of tending, sticking to one's own knitting. And so that's part of what he is really talking about there. And Ricardo was not really a contemporary, he came a little bit after Smith. We talked a lot about free trade, and that's the idea. When economists use the word trade, they're almost always talking about trade across international boundaries. He talked about the fact that trade is a good thing. And keep in mind that when we first talked about it, we talked about his opposition to what were called the Corn Laws, which were in effect for many decades in Britain, which were really intended to protect the landowning nobility classes who owned most of the land, including the farmland, and it kept imported grains out. And because imported grains coming in means there's less scarcity, and so the price of that thing falls. Well, they didn't want the price to fall of the output that they were producing. They wanted to keep food prices high. And Ricardo said that's not a good system. And high food prices is not good, particularly for the poor. And then furthermore, we should allow trade because if we don't allow grain to come in, it may be that those countries that try to export grain to us won't also import from us things that we produce, like manufactured goods and textiles and things like that. So that's an interesting argument, and Ricardo was really one of the very first economists to use sort of these ideas of why countries should trade with one another, that the effects are considered to be beneficial. Okay. So I think I've covered everything that is pretty much going to be on the exam itself, and we do have some time left over, so I'm happy to take any questions you've got. I'm more than glad to construct any kind of graph or model that is something you'd like to see again. I'm more than happy to do that. So does anybody have any questions for me? Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box either, I don't think. No, it doesn't look like it. So, well, okay, well, I'll make the exam available here in a bit, and so look for that. And if you do have any questions about anything as you're taking the exam, let me know. Just send me an email. I'll be around all week and over the weekend, so I'll be watching that. So it'll be available for you. So have a look. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm really glad to get with you. If you do send me an email, just make sure you tell me what section you're in. Very often it's kind of hard to know, and sometimes I have students in more than one section, so it's really hard to know what class they're talking about. So just make sure you tell me that. If you want me to call you, leave a number. I'll be more than glad to call you, and we'll figure out what how I can help you. Okay. So anyway, if nobody has any questions, I'll just say good luck to you. It was nice having you in class. Hope everyone has a good summer, and good luck with everything down the road.